January 11th, 1944, 25,000 feet above Oschersleben, Germany. Through the frost-etched canopy of his P-5 1B Mustang, Major James Howard watches 30 Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 190 swarm around a formation of B-17 flying fortresses. His wingman is gone. His squadron, scattered. The protocol is clear. Rejoin your flight. Return to formation. But below him, the bombers of the 401st Bomb Group are dying. Howard keys his radio. The bomber crews hear 2 words. I'm staying. What happens in the next 30 minutes will defy every tactical manual ever written. 1 pilot, 1 Mustang, with malfunctioning guns. 30 German fighters. No height advantage, no surprise, no backup. Just a decision that a veteran of the Flying Tigers made in the span of a heartbeat. A decision that would earn him the only Medal of Honor awarded to a fighter pilot in the European theater, and inspire Andy Rooney to call it the greatest fighter pilot story of World War II. This is a story about what one man believed his aircraft could do when there was no other choice. This is the story of Ding Hao, the best, and the 30 minutes that proved it. James Howell Howard should never have been in the sky over Germany that winter morning. Born in Canton, China, on April 8, 1913, while his ophthalmologist father taught eye surgery at the University Medical School, Howard's childhood read like adventure fiction. At age 11, he and his father were kidnapped by Manchurian bandits and held for 10 weeks before they escaped. That experience, surviving through quick thinking and nerve, shaped the pilot he would become. The family returned to St. Louis. Howard excelled in school, graduated from Pomona College in 1937, with plans to follow his father into medicine. Instead, on December 29, 1937, he walked into a Navy recruiting office. By 1939, he wore the wings of a naval aviator. By 1941, flying F-3F biplanes from the deck of the USS Enterprise in Pearl Harbor, he was restless. China was burning. Japan's invasion consumed the country where Howard had been born. In June 1941, Ensign Howard resigned his commission and signed a contract with the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, SAMCO, a thin cover for something that didn't officially exist, the American Volunteer Group. The Flying Tigers, under Claire Chennault's command, Howard joined the 2nd Pursuit Squadron, the Panda Bears, flying Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks with shark teeth painted on their noses. The pay was $600 to $750 a month, plus $500 for every confirmed kill. But Howard didn't join for the money. As he wrote later, this was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to exercise some leadership and authority. In Burma and Thailand, flying from Toungoo and Kunming, Howard discovered what he was, a hunter. On January 3, 1942, during a strike near Raiheng, Thailand, Howard got his first aerial victories. 3 Japanese Ki-27s destroyed on the ground, while his wingman, Tex Hill, kept his tail clear. Through 56 combat missions, Howard refined his tactics. He was aggressive, independent. He didn't wait for the enemy to come to him. He went to them. By the time the Flying Tigers disbanded on July 4, 1942, Howard had 6 confirmed kills. More importantly, he had learned something about himself. He didn't panic in impossible situations. He didn't calculate odds. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it. As one of his squadron mates would later observe, maybe 1 out of 10 good fighter pilots will be one of the hunters. James Howard was one of the hunters. When Howard returned to the United States, he made a choice that would define his future. Despite his Navy background, an unpleasant encounter with a Navy base commander who seemed unimpressed with his Flying Tigers service pushed him toward the Army. In January 1943, Howard was commissioned as a captain in the Army Air Forces. By 1943, promoted to major, he took command of the 356th Fighter Squadron in the 354th Fighter Group, the first group to take the Merlin-powered P-51B Mustang into combat over Europe. They called themselves the Pioneer Mustang Group because they were pushing deeper into German airspace than any escort had gone before. Howard's P-5 1B bore a name painted in English and Chinese characters on its nose, Ding Hao, a greeting the Flying Tigers had used, meaning the best or thumbs up. 6 Japanese flags decorated one side of the fuselage. Soon, Howard intended to add swastikas to match them. The Mustang was everything the P-40 was not. 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns, top speed over 425 miles per hour, depending on altitude. And with external drop tanks, the range to go all the way to Berlin and back, something no other Allied fighter could do in early 1944. But range meant nothing without tactics, and tactics meant nothing without the will to use them. Howard's personality shaped his approach to command. He was quiet, almost taciturn on the ground, modest to the point of self-deprecation, but in the cockpit, he was transformed. He didn't believe in defensive flying. He didn't believe in waiting. He believed in speed, aggression, and getting so close to the enemy that they couldn't miss, and neither could he. His squadron loved him for it. His superiors worried about it. Independent pilots sometimes got themselves killed. On the night of January 10th, 1944, at RAF Boxted in England, Howard attended the mission briefing for the next day's operation. 8th Air Force was launching one of its largest strikes since the devastating Schweinfurt raid 3 months earlier. 525 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 138 B-24 Liberators would hit aircraft production facilities at Oschersleben and Halberstadt. About 100 miles southwest of Berlin, the targets were critical. The Focke-Wulf 190 assembly plant at Oschersleben alone was producing hundreds of fighters, monthly. Destroying it could cripple Luftwaffe fighter production. The plan was complex. P-47 Thunderbolts would escort the bombers partway in. Then, Howard's P-51s from the 354th Fighter Group would take over escort duties at the target. After the bombing run, fresh P-47s would meet the returning bombers while the Mustangs headed home. It was a good plan. It assumed, as all plans do, that everything would go according to schedule. Weather over England on the morning of January 11th was deteriorating. Heavy clouds, icing conditions. Some P-47 units received recall orders and turned back. The bomber stream pressed on. By the time Howard's 50 P-51s reached the rendezvous point, the bomber formations had already released their ordnance and were turning for home, and the Luftwaffe was waiting. German intelligence had learned to time their attacks, wait for the short-range escorts to reach their fuel limits and turn back, then hit the bombers when they were most vulnerable, just after they dropped their bombs, flying straight and level, when the formations were beginning to spread out. As Howard's formation approached from behind the bomber stream, he could see it developing. Hundreds of German fighters, FW-190s, Bf-190s, twin-engine Bf-110 Zerstörer, circling like sharks, picking their targets. 8th Air Force intelligence would later estimate 500 Luftwaffe fighters in the air that day. It was the stiffest resistance since Schweinfurt. Howard keyed his radio and began directing his squadrons, 2 squadrons to protect the middle and rear formations. His own squadron, the 356th, would push forward to cover the lead elements. Then his squadron broke into flights of 4. Then pairs. In the chaos of 3-dimensional aerial combat over Germany, formations didn't hold. They couldn't. The sky was full of contrails, tracer fire, falling aircraft, parachutes blossoming white against the winter landscape below. It was a melee, a knife fight at 25,000 feet. Howard spotted a Messerschmitt Bf-110 lining up on a B-17. The twin-engine Zerstörer was a heavy fighter, slower than the Mustang but dangerous, with its nose-mounted cannons and rockets. Howard rolled inverted, pulled the stick back, and dove. The Bf-110 never saw him. Howard closed to less than 200 yards, centered the gun sight, and pressed the firing button. All 4 guns hammered. The Bf-110 broke away trailing smoke, then pitched nose down into a terminal dive. In the violence of that attack, executing a high G pullout and climbing back to altitude, Howard lost sight of his wingman. He scanned the sky, contrails everywhere, aircraft everywhere, but no friendly formation, no wingman. He was alone. This was the moment that defined everything that followed. Standard procedure was unambiguous. Rejoin your flight. Assemble with your squadron. Don't engage alone. Fighter pilots who went lone wolf in the middle of a furball usually didn't come home. Howard climbed back toward the bomber stream, looking for his squadron. And then he saw them, the B-17s of the 401st Bomb Group, lead formation, no fighter cover, and swarming around them like hornets, 30 or more German fighters. The 401st was flying its 14th combat mission. They were a new group, inexperienced. So far they'd lost only one aircraft in combat, to flak. Today was about to teach them what the air war over Germany really meant. Howard had a choice: rejoin his squadron somewhere in the chaos behind him, or dive alone into 30 German fighters to help bombers he didn't know in a group that wasn't even his assigned protection responsibility. He thought about the Flying Tigers. He thought about Chenault's first rule: attack, always attack. He thought about the P-51 beneath him, an aircraft that could outrun, outdive, and outmaneuver everything the Luftwaffe had. An aircraft that, if flown aggressively enough, might convince 30 German pilots that they were facing more than one American fighter. James Howard pushed the throttle forward and dove toward the swarm. As he later told reporters, with characteristic understatement, "I seen my duty and I done it." The bomber crews of the 401st Bomb Group watched a single P-51 Mustang slash down from above them and disappear into a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s. They thought it was suicide. The first FW-190 Howard engaged was climbing toward the bombers from below. Howard dove past the B-17s, rolled to track the 190, and closed so aggressively that the German pilot never had a chance to maneuver. Howard's guns converged at 200 yards. At that range, 8.50 caliber machine guns firing 3,400 rounds collectively per minute didn't just damage aircraft, they disintegrated them. The FW-190 came apart. The pilot jettisoned his canopy and bailed out so close that Howard nearly collided with him. "I nearly ran into his canopy," Howard said later, as he threw it off to bail out. One down. Howard pulled up in a chandelle, a climbing turn that traded airspeed for altitude, and immediately spotted another threat, a Messerschmitt Bf-100 and 9 maneuvering to attack the bombers from the flank. The 109 pilot saw Howard at the same moment and broke hard, trying to escape. The Bf-109 was fast, but the Mustang was faster. Howard stayed with him through the turn, fired a burst, and watched the 109 trail smoke as it disengaged. 2 down, or at least damaged. That's when Howard noticed something wrong. His guns weren't firing smoothly. The P-51B carried 4.50 caliber Brownings, 2 in each wing. When he pressed the firing button, he could feel the familiar vibration, but something felt off. He fired another burst at a distant target. Only one gun was firing. 3 of his 4 guns had jammed. This was not uncommon in the P-51B. The wing-mounted guns were prone to jamming in high J maneuvers or prolonged firing. The cold at 25,000 feet made the problem worse. Oil congealed, springs seized. Howard was facing 30 German fighters with 75% of his firepower gone. He could leave. His fuel was already running low. The rational decision was to disengage, climb to safety, and try to rejoin friendly forces. But below him, the bombers were still under attack. FO-190S and Bf-109S were making coordinated passes, 4-plane Schwärmer coming in from different angles. The B-17 gunners were throwing up curtains of .50 caliber fire, but it wasn't enough. The Germans were experienced. They knew how to use their speed and numbers. Howard made his decision. He would stay until his ammunition ran out, or his fuel ran out, or he was shot down. With one gun, what followed was a running battle that defied tactical logic. Howard didn't try to dogfight. He couldn't, not outnumbered 30-1. Instead, he used the Mustang's speed and his own aggression to become unpredictable. He would dive at high speed into a forming attack, fire his single gun, and the Germans would scatter, unsure whether they were facing one fighter or several, unwilling to risk a head-on pass against a pilot who seemed to have no concept of self-preservation. Then Howard would zoom climb back to altitude, scan for the next threat, and do it again. The bomber crews watched in astonishment. The lone Mustang was everywhere, diving from above, slashing across the front of their formation, breaking up attacks before they could develop, making impossible deflection shots. Inside the cockpit of Ding Hao, Howard was fighting with cold precision. He knew his fuel state. He knew his ammunition, one gun, maybe 300 rounds left. He knew that every second he stayed increased the chances he wouldn't make it home. But he also knew something else. The Germans were confused. Post-war examination of Luftwaffe after-action reports from January 11, 1944, would reveal references to coordinated American fighter defense and multiple escort fighters over the 401st Bomb Group. The German pilots couldn't believe one aircraft was making all those attacks. It violated their tactical assumptions. So they hesitated. They broke off attacks. They wasted time trying to coordinate against a threat they couldn't properly identify. That hesitation kept the bombers alive. Howard spotted a Junkers Ju-88 twin-engine bomber approaching with air-to-air rockets slung beneath its wings. The Ju-88 would launch from outside machine gun range, firing salvos of rockets into the tight bomber formations, where even a near miss could bring down a B-17. Howard turned hard and accelerated toward it. The Ju-88 crew saw him coming and broke away. Howard fired his single gun, knowing he probably couldn't bring it down, but gambling that the threat would be enough. It was. The Ju-88 dove away, rockets unfired. Another Messerschmitt Bf-109 swept past. Howard snap-rolled, pulled lead, and fired. The 109 erupted in flames. 3 confirmed kills, maybe 4. The bomber crews would later insist they'd seen him down 5 or 6, but Howard couldn't be sure. Everything was happening too fast. Track 1. Target. Fire. Break. Acquire another target. Fire again. Check 6 o'clock for threats. Check fuel. Check altitude. Check the bombers. Then, somewhere around 15 minutes into the fight, his single remaining gun ran dry. Howard was out of ammunition. Any other pilot would have called it quits. He'd stayed longer than anyone could expect. He'd done more than duty required. His fuel gauge was showing dangerous levels. He needed to disengage and head for home before he ran out of fuel over enemy territory. But the Germans were still attacking the 401st. Howard decided to bluff. He kept diving at forming attacks. No guns, no ammunition, just the P-51's speed and the hope that the Germans wouldn't call his bluff. It worked. Over and over, German fighters would line up on a B-17, and Howard would come screaming down from above. The Germans couldn't know his guns were empty. They broke off, scattered, reformed for another attempt, and Howard would do it again. Inside the B-17 knockout dropper, tail gunner Staff Sergeant Frank Wysotsky watched the lone Mustang make pass after pass. He counted. He lost count. Later, he would tell debriefing officers, he was all over the wing, across it, and around it. They can't give that boy a big enough award. In the lead, B-17 of the 401st, Major Allison C. Brooks, the mission commander, watched the impossible unfold. His radio operator asked, "Who is that pilot? Do we know who that is?" Brooks didn't know, but he knew what he was seeing. For sheer determination and guts, it was the greatest exhibition I'd ever seen. It was a case of one lone American against what seemed to be the entire Luftwaffe. At about 30 minutes into the engagement, Howard's fuel situation became critical. The gauge showed he had perhaps 15 minutes of flying time left at cruise power, maybe less. He was over Germany. Alone. He needed every drop to make it back to England. The German attacks were tapering off. Some straggling P-51s from other squadrons were appearing on the scene. The 401st Bomb Group was through the worst of it. Howard waggled his wings to the bombers, the universal fighter pilot signal for goodbye, and turned for home. The bomber crews never forgot it. 16 different B-17 crews from the 401st Bomb Group would file after-action reports, mentioning the lone Mustang. 16 crews describing the same impossible thing. One fighter pilot holding off the entire Luftwaffe. Howard landed at RAF Boxted, nursing his fuel tanks. When Technical Sergeant George Van Hare, one of the armourers, jumped up on his wing and waved to ask if he'd shot any down, Howard held up 2 fingers, then 3, shaking them uncertainly. Maybe 2 or 3. He didn't mention that he'd kept fighting after his guns jammed. He didn't mention the bluff. He didn't mention the 30 minutes. The gun camera film told part of the story. Intelligence officers would credit him with 3 confirmed kills, possibly 4, but the real story was being told in the debriefing rooms of the 401st Bomb Group. At Deenathorpe Station 128, the 401st Bomb Group's home base, something unusual was happening. Normally, after-action reports from bomber crews were routine. Target hit, flak moderate, fighters encountered, damage sustained. Clinical. Professional. But on January 11th, 1944, crew after crew was telling the same story with something that wasn't clinical at all. Or, Colonel Harold Bowman, commander of the 401st, listened to the reports and asked the question that would set everything in motion. Who was that Mustang pilot who took on the German Air Force single-handedly and saved our 401st Bomb Group from disaster? Nobody knew. The pilot hadn't identified himself on the radio. The 401st bomber crews could describe the aircraft. A P-51B Mustang with markings they couldn't quite make out at altitude, but not the pilot. The 8th Air Force intelligence staff began investigating. The 354th Fighter Group was the only P-51 unit in the target area. They cross-referenced mission reports, pilot debriefings, and gun camera footage. Major James Howard's report was characteristically understated. Engaged enemy fighters, shot down a Bf-100 and possibly 2 or 3 more, returned to base low on fuel and ammunition. He mentioned nothing about staying alone for 30 minutes, nothing about fighting with jammed guns, nothing about the bluff, but his gun camera footage showed something extraordinary. Multiple engagements from impossible angles. Diving attacks that no cautious pilot would attempt. Footage that confirmed he'd been exactly where the 401st bomber crews said he was. Alone, outnumbered, and attacking anyway. The pieces came together. The lone P-51 that saved the 401st Bomb Group was Major James Howard, 356th Fighter Squadron Commander. On January 19, 1944, 8 days after the mission, the New York Times reported, Major James H. Howard was identified today as the lone United States fighter pilot who for more than 30 minutes fought off about 30 German fighters trying to attack 8th Air Force B-17 formations returning from Oschersleben and Halberstadt in Germany. The Army Air Forces decided this story needed to be told. America needed heroes. The air war over Europe was brutal. Casualties were staggering. Bomber crews were being shot out of the sky faster than training schools could replace them. But here was a story of absolute valor. One American pilot who decided that 30-to-1 odds didn't matter. The Army Air Forces held a press conference in London. Howard, promoted to lieutenant colonel the month after the mission, stood in front of reporters from the BBC, Associated Press, CBS, and Stars and Stripes. Among them, Walter Cronkite and Andy Rooney. Howard told them what happened. He was modest, uncomfortable with attention. He kept trying to deflect praise to the bomber crews who'd fought through the flak and fighters to hit their targets. The reporters weren't having it. Andy Rooney, covering the air war for Stars and Stripes, would later call Howard's action the greatest fighter pilot story of World War II. The story exploded across American media. The Saturday Evening Post ran an article titled Mustang Whip. Popular Science published Fighting at 425 miles per hour. True magazine called him One-Man Air Force. But the most important story was being written in Washington. The Medal of Honor citation. The Medal of Honor is not given lightly. It requires documentation, eyewitness testimony from multiple sources, proof that the action went above and beyond the call of duty and involved risk of life in combat with the enemy. The 401st Bomb Group provided 16 eyewitness statements. Gun camera footage corroborated the timeline. German losses recorded for January 11th matched the engagement. The citation was drafted, reviewed, and approved. On June 5, 1944, less than 5 months after the mission, Lieutenant General Karl Spaatz, commander of United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, pinned the Medal of Honor on Lieutenant Colonel James Howard at a ceremony in London. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty, in action with the enemy near Oschersleben, Germany, on the 11th of January 1944. While Colonel Howard could have waited to attempt to assemble his group before engaging the enemy, he chose instead to attack single-handed a formation of more than 30 German airplanes. Howard became the only fighter pilot awarded the Medal of Honor in the European theater during World War II. The P-51 Mustang didn't make James Howard brave, but it made his bravery effective. Understanding why Howard succeeded requires understanding what the Mustang could do that no other Allied fighter could in January 1944. The P-51B was powered by a Packard V1650 3 Merlin engine, a license-built version of the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin. At 1,380 horsepower, it produced enough power to maintain performance at altitudes where German fighters struggled. At 25,000 feet, the Mustang could still accelerate, still turn, still fight. Maximum speed, 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The FW190A8 topped out around 408 miles per hour at the same altitude. The Mustang was faster. The Bf-109G could match the Mustang in a climb, but not in a dive. The P-51B's laminar flow wing design allowed it to reach speeds in excess of 500 miles per hour in a dive without structural failure, speeds that would rip the wings off most contemporary fighters. This mattered in combat. Howard used dive attacks because he could dive faster than the Germans could follow. He could build speed, strike, and zoom climb away before the enemy could react. Range was the game changer. With two 75-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B could fly 850 miles to the target, fight, and fly 850 miles home. This was revolutionary. P-47 Thunderbolts could escort bombers perhaps 400 miles. P-38 Lightnings might stretch to 600 miles, but Berlin was 600 miles from England. The Mustang could go all the way to Berlin and back. On January 11, 1944, that range meant Howard could stay with the 401st Bomb Group for 30 minutes and still have enough fuel to return to England. AP-47 would have been forced to turn back 15 minutes into the fight. The Mustang gave Howard time, and time saved lives. But the aircraft had weaknesses. The wing-mounted .50 caliber guns were notoriously prone to jamming. Exactly what happened to Howard. Pilots learned to fire in short bursts to prevent overheating. Howard knew this. When 3 guns jammed, he adapted. The P-51B also had a structural quirk that pilots discovered the hard way. It didn't like tight turns at high speed. Pull too many Gs with a full fuel load and you could warp the wing structure. Howard, a veteran pilot with hundreds of hours in high-performance fighters, knew how to read the aircraft. He knew when to push it and when to back off. This is what experience does. It turns an aircraft's capabilities into tactical advantages and works around its limitations. The Mustang also had a psychological impact. the few W-190 and Bf-109 pilots over Oschersleben that day expected P-47s and P-38s. They'd learned those aircraft's capabilities. They knew their range. They knew their limitations. But P-51s were new to the European theatre. The 354th Fighter Group, Howard's unit, was the first to fly them in combat. The Luftwaffe intelligence reports from early 1944 show confusion. They didn't know the Mustang's performance envelope. They didn't know its range. Some German pilots thought they were facing a new type of RAF fighter. This uncertainty worked in Howard's favor. When he kept diving at them, kept attacking long after any sane P-47 or P-38 pilot would have turned for home, the German pilots didn't know what to think. Was this one aircraft? Multiple aircraft? A new American tactic? That confusion bought seconds, and seconds saved lives. But ultimately, the Mustang was just a machine. It didn't decide to stay when outnumbered 30-1. It didn't decide to keep attacking with jammed guns. It didn't decide to bluff with empty guns. James Howard made those decisions. The Mustang made them possible. Howard made them real. After the Medal of Honor ceremony in June 1944, Lieutenant Colonel James Howard returned to combat flying. He wasn't finished with the Luftwaffe. On January 30th, 1944, during a mission over Brunswick, he shot down another Bf-110. On April 8th, 1944, he destroyed a few W-190 over Brunswick. These would be his last aerial victories of the war, bringing his total to 6 Japanese aircraft destroyed with the Flying Tigers and 6 German aircraft destroyed over Europe. He was an ace in 2 theaters. One of the few. But Howard's contribution to the war didn't end with his own trigger finger. In June 1944, the same month he received the Medal of Honor, Howard helped direct fighter cover for the Normandy landings. His experience organizing complex fighter escort operations made him invaluable in planning the air support that kept the Luftwaffe away from the D-Day beaches. By January 1945, promoted to full colonel, Howard was assigned as base commander of Pinellas Army Airfield in Florida. The war in Europe was winding down. The need for experienced combat leaders in training commands was growing. Howard spent the final months of the war teaching a new generation of pilots. When World War II ended, Howard was released from active duty on November 30th, 1945, but his service to aviation continued. He transferred to the newly established United States Air Force Reserve in 1947 and was promoted to Brigadier General on March 22, 1948. He commanded the 96th Bombardment Wing based at Scott Field near Belleville, Illinois, leading a unit equipped with the B-36 Peacemaker, America's first intercontinental strategic bomber. The hunter from Burma and Germany was now overseeing nuclear deterrence. But Howard's post-war life wasn't just military. In 1946, he became Director of Aeronautics for the city of St. Louis, overseeing operations at Lambert Field. He understood airports. He understood air traffic. He understood how to make the transition from military aviation to civil aviation. In 1961, Howard founded Howard Research, a systems engineering corporation working on the Navy Polaris missile program. The man who'd fought at treetop level in P-40s and dodged flak at 25,000 feet in Mustangs was now helping design intercontinental ballistic missiles. In 1965, he sold his company and retired from the Air Force Reserve. He moved to Bel Air Bluffs, Florida, where he lived quietly. But some stories don't die quietly. On January 11, 1994, the 50th anniversary of the Oschersleben mission, the Pinellas County Board of Commissioners proclaimed General Howard Day and presented him with a plaque. A permanent exhibit honoring Howard was unveiled at St. Petersburg Clearwater International Airport, the same field where he'd once served as base commander. Howard attended the ceremony. He was 80 years old. When asked about that day over Germany, he gave the same answer he'd given reporters 50 years earlier. "I seen my duty and I done it." In 1991, Howard published his autobiography, Roar of the Tiger, focusing primarily on his Flying Tigers experiences. The book reveals a man who was more comfortable talking about his squadron mates than about himself. Even in his own memoir, the January 11th mission receives only modest attention. Howard devoted more pages to technical discussions of P-40 tactics than to his Medal of Honor action. Howard lived his and moved on. On March 18, 1995, Brigadier General James Howell Howard died at Bay Pines Veterans Hospital in Florida. He was 81 years old. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, joining the pantheon of American warriors whose names are carved into white stone on the hillside overlooking the Potomac. But Howard's real legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was carried in memory by the bomber crews who watched a lone Mustang refuse to leave them. The brutal mathematics of the air war put Howard's action in perspective. Of the 25 crews from the 401st Bomb Group that survived January 11, 1944, the crews that watched Howard fight alone, 8 were lost before D-Day. German fighters destroyed 6. Flak claimed 2 more. Captain R.W. Beer's B-17 went down over Frankfurt on January 29th, 18 days after Howard saved them. German fighters claimed more 401st B-17s over Leipzig on February 20th, Frankfurt again on March 2nd, Marienburg on April 9th, Oschersleben again in May, Dessau on May 28th. Some crewmen bailed out and became prisoners of war. Many were killed in action. The men of the 401st who survived the war never forgot January 11th, 1944. In post-war reunions, they told their children and grandchildren about the pilot who stayed when he should have left, the pilot who fought with jammed guns, the pilot who kept diving at German fighters even when his ammunition ran out. In 1985, at a reunion in Phoenix, several 401st veterans sought out Howard. They wanted to thank him. Howard, characteristically uncomfortable with praise, thanked them instead, for pressing on to the target, for flying through flak and fighters, for doing the dangerous work of destroying Germany's war machine. But the bomber crews insisted, "You saved our lives that day." Howard's response was the same as it had been in 1944. "I was just doing my job." Lessons from January 11, 1944. Military historians have studied Howard's action for decades, trying to extract tactical lessons. The consensus: what he did shouldn't be emulated because it shouldn't have worked. 1 fighter against 30 fighters violates every principle of aerial combat. You assemble numerical advantage. You coordinate attacks. You don't engage alone without height, speed, or surprise. Howard had none of those advantages. He succeeded anyway. Why? First, aggression. Howard didn't calculate odds. He attacked immediately, violently, and continuously. This disrupted German formations and created uncertainty. The Germans expected defensive tactics from outnumbered fighters. They got offensive fury instead. Second, unpredictability. Howard never developed a pattern. He attacked from different angles, different altitudes, different directions. The Germans couldn't anticipate where he'd come from next. Third, psychology. By continuing to attack even with jammed guns and empty ammunition, Howard created the illusion of multiple aircraft. The Germans literally couldn't believe one pilot would keep fighting under those circumstances. Their own tactical doctrine said it was impossible, so they assumed it must be multiple aircraft, which made them cautious. Fourth, the aircraft. The P-51 Mustang's performance envelope gave Howard options: speed to escape, maneuverability to reposition, range to persist. An inferior aircraft would have forced him to disengage. Fifth, experience. Howard's Flying Tigers combat 56 missions in P-40s against Japanese fighters gave him situation awareness that newer pilots lacked. He'd been outnumbered before. He'd learned to manage chaos. He trusted his instincts. But the deepest lesson has nothing to do with tactics. It has to do with character. James Howard saw bombers under attack. He made a choice. Not because regulations required it, not because his mission orders specified it, but because he couldn't leave them. That decision, to stay when every tactical manual said to leave, defines what the Medal of Honor recognizes: actions above and beyond the call of duty. Duty would have been rejoining his squadron. Duty would have been following protocol. Duty would have been the safe choice. Howard chose something beyond duty. He chose to trust his aircraft, his skills, and his willingness to die if that's what it took. Post-war interviews with surviving Luftwaffe pilots who flew on January 11, 1944, reveal their perspective. Most didn't remember the specific engagement. They flew hundreds of missions over Germany. But some recalled the frustration of attacking bomber formations that day and being repeatedly driven off by aggressive American fighters. One former Bf 109 pilot, interviewed in the 1970s, remembered, "We expected the escorts to turn back when their fuel ran low. They always did. But that day, some didn't leave. They stayed and stayed. We couldn't understand it. Where were they getting the fuel? They didn't know they were remembering James Howard and Ding Hao." German tactical analysis from early 1944 shows the Luftwaffe's growing concern about the new American escort fighter. Intelligence reports noted the Mustang's unprecedented range and recommended avoiding combat with them, except under favorable conditions. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe pilots were being taught to identify the Mustang on sight and to treat it as a priority threat. The hunter had become the hunted. Today, surviving P-51 Mustangs are treasured warbirds. They perform at airshows worldwide, their Merlin engines producing that distinctive growl that Howard would have recognized instantly. Several museums display P-51s with full Flying Tiger-style nose art and victory markings, honoring the pilots who flew them. But Ding Hao, Howard's specific aircraft, did not survive the war. It was likely scrapped or lost to combat after Howard transferred to other duties. The legacy of the Mustang isn't in museums. It's in what the aircraft represented, the industrial and engineering capacity that allowed America to produce 15,000 P-51s between 1940 and 1945, to field them globally, to maintain them under combat conditions, to train pilots to fly them effectively. The Mustang didn't win the air war over Europe alone, but it made victory possible by extending American fighter protection deep into Germany. Before the Mustang, bomber losses to German fighters were unsustainable. After the Mustang achieved operational deployment, the Luftwaffe was systematically destroyed. By May 1945, there were no German fighters left to intercept Allied bombers. The sky belonged to America. January 11th, 1944, 25,000 feet above Oschersleben, Germany. 30 German fighters swarming around a formation of B-17s, one American pilot making a choice the tactical manuals said was suicide. Major Allison Brooks, watching from the lead bomber, would later write, "For sheer determination and guts, it was the greatest exhibition I've ever seen. It was a case of one lone American against what seemed to be the entire Luftwaffe. He was all over the wing, across and around it. They can't give that boy a big enough award. The Medal of Honor, promotion to lieutenant colonel, coverage in every major newspaper in America, the adulation of an entire bomb group that knew they'd witnessed something extraordinary. And through it all, James Howard remained the same quiet, modest squadron commander who'd rather talk about his aircraft than about himself." In 1991, writing Roar of the Tiger at age 78, Howard devoted pages to explaining P-40 tactics over Burma, but summed up January 11, 1944, in a few paragraphs. He mentioned the bombers under attack. He mentioned the decision to stay. He mentioned the fight. Then he moved on to the next mission. Because for James Howard, that's what it was, the next mission. Another day in the air. Another chance to do what he'd been doing since Burma in 1942, hunting. Today, a plaque at St. Petersburg Clearwater International Airport commemorates Brigadier General James H. Howard. Visitors walk past it without knowing who he was or what he did. It's a small plaque, modest, exactly how Howard would have wanted it. But at Arlington National Cemetery, his headstone carries the Medal of Honor citation. The words are there for anyone who wants to read them, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. The last bomber crews who witnessed January 11th, 1944, are gone now. The Luftwaffe pilots who faced Ding Hao that day are gone. James Howard is gone. Even the P-51B that made it possible is gone. What remains is the story of a pilot who saw bombers under attack and decided that 30-1 odds didn't matter. The story of a P-51 Mustang that gave one man the tools to make impossible decisions work. The story of 30 minutes over Germany that proved what courage looks like when protocol says run, but conscience says stay. Andy Rooney called it the greatest fighter pilot story of World War II. He wasn't wrong, because in the end, this wasn't a story about perfect tactics or superior technology or numerical advantage. It was a story about a man who looked at an impossible situation and said, "I seen my duty and I done it." And then he did it. Alone. For 30 minutes that the bomber crews would never forget. Against odds that should have killed him. With a Mustang he trusted completely. And a name painted on the nose that meant exactly what it said. Ding Hao.